Mitchell. I'm going to talk about opportunities in AI for precision health here in Alberta. I'm super excited to be here and super excited about the opportunities. So I'm just going to talk about three things today, basically. I'm going to talk about three different AI technologies and their medical applications. So just three things, that's it, and you'll see them numbered as we go through the talk, so to keep you informed of what's going on. And then, of course, I'll wind up with some discussions about translation to the clinic. So three things. First one, deep convolutional neural networks. And the primary application for this AI technology is in medical imaging. So before we talk about CNNs, deep CNNs, I'm going to go back to a time before they were really on the scene. They were still being used academically in labs, but it was before the big revolution where deep learning sort of came on the scene to the general public. And that happened around 2012. But just 15 years ago, there was a paper published about a captcha or a technique to prove you're human online. We do this all the time nowadays. But if you remember, back around this time, this sort of challenge would come up. Pick the cats. They'd show you 10 pictures of cats and dogs, and you had to pick the cats or pick the dogs. And a lot of research went into this, believe it or not. And this particular paper said that humans can basically solve this perfectly in about 30 seconds. But computer classification had a real hard time doing this. It was really tough for computers at the time to do this. And in the paper, they said, classification rates of 60% or more are going to be really difficult without some kind of significant advance in the state of the art. They're not talking like 100% or 95%. Even getting to 60% was going to be really difficult. So 6 years later, the AI competition organization Kaggle actually got sponsored to put out a competition to see if people could solve this. So this is from 2013, and it might be a little hard to read, but it says there, in this competition, you'll write an algorithm to classify whether images contain either a dog or a cat. This is easy for humans, dogs, and cats. Your computer will find it a bit more difficult, a little tongue in cheek there. What's interesting about this is a year later, they had to shut the competition down because it was essentially solved. There were numerous groups that had accuracies above 98%, and the top scoring algorithms were above 99%. So in the space of 7 years, from 2017 to 2014, this went from being a problem that was considered essentially unsolvable, extremely difficult, to being nailed, completely solved. So what happened? What happened between 2007 and 2014? Well, what happened was convolutional neural networks running on GPUs. So this is the ImageNet competition. ImageNet was a large challenge organized by lots of people, but primarily out of Stanford, a collection of 14 million images at the time with crowdsourced labels and 22,000 categories. So each image is of one primary object. For example, some of the high-level categories included plants and animals and people and structures. So you might see a picture of an airplane, a picture of a cat, a picture of a cactus, and your algorithm would have to classify that into one of 22,000 categories, or sometimes they narrow it down to just 1,000 higher level categories, but still a difficult task. And for the longest time after this competition was started, accuracies remained below 75%. So 1 in 4 predictions were wrong. And compared to the typical person, if you or I looked at these images, we'd be between 85 and 90%. And if you spent some time working on it and studying the images and learning what to cue on, you could get up to around 95%. So even humans aren't perfect at identifying all these images. As you can imagine, these were scraped off the web and varying quality. So perfection is not even achievable by human experts. But in 2012, for the first time, a deep neural network was used. And this was work done by the group at the Vector Institute and University of Toronto. And they really revolutionized. It was like the iPhone moment for deep learning when the whole world sort of woke up and took notice. And their entry that year improved the state of the art by almost 10% after years of sub 1% improvement. So this was a real step wedge moment in the technology. And afterwards, the technology improved more or less linearly each year using variations of the technology that they proposed. These deep convolutional neural networks, which have been around for a while, but the difference here was that they were able to accelerate them massively by running them on parallel hardware, gaming graphics cards at the time. And that allowed them to do a lot more training, and that improved the quality of these nets. So what do these things look like? Well, this is a common one. You can just download this off the web. You don't have to code it up. And without going into too much detail, over on the left is an image of a cell, let's say. And the blue layers look at this image and they move a little patch, essentially iterate a little patch across this image and look for features in the image. And the closer the layer is to the image, the lower level features it picks up. So the frontmost or the lowest layer in the net will look at things like blobs of color and edges and things like that. Those features are passed up to the next layer. And so the next layer is not looking directly at the image, but at things of color blobs and edges. And it might form features like corners or lines. And then those features are passed up and so on and so forth. Every red layer basically picks out the strongest, the best performing features and also zooms out. So it has a broader look at the image. You're not seeing such fine detail. And this happens again and again and again until you get to the green layers on the right. And those are essentially used to make decisions. And the last one you can see is 1 by 1 by 1,000. It's trying to predict which of 1,000 possible categories this image falls into. That's sort of a high level hand waving approach of how these things work. What's neat about this is you can look inside and see what each layer is essentially responding to. And this is a very low level layer in this network, and you can see it's mostly looking at lines, wavy lines, and some stipple patterns and things like that. So very sort of fine detail patterns across the image. If you go up a little bit in this network, you start to see interesting patterns appear, more complicated lines and more interesting patterns and more colors even. You continue to go up and you see some really interesting patterns appear. Things look like leaves, blocks, bubbles, feathers. And remember, none of this is programmed. This is all learned as it's shown millions and millions of images. It learns what it needs to detect in the images to perform its classification task. If you go up even higher in the image, this is an actual, one of the actual images generated from what the network is detecting up at layer 40. And you look at this, you go, oh, that's, when I saw this, I thought, wow, no wonder this thing is really good at identifying cats versus dogs. Here's a picture. This is one of the training pictures or a test picture in the test data set. And look at this. The net has on its own essentially learned to identify cats, ears, and kittens. Again, no programming required. It can learn this from scratch. It's initiated with random values, and in a very short order, it learns to pick these things out of images. So it's no wonder that this net is really good at differentiating cats from dogs. And this is what the folks in the Kaggle competition used. They just downloaded this net and ran it through. And lo and behold, they're getting above 99% for classifying these objects. And now you can do this on your computer. If you're interested, send me a note afterwards. If you've got an Apple Mac, you can do this without writing any code at all. You just put images in a folder and fire it off, and away it goes. Now, last time I did it, it took about 7 minutes, and I got 98% accuracy differentiating cats from dogs. So in the space of 15, 16 years, this went from being something that was essentially considered impossible to something you can do trivially on your own in half an hour. So it's caused an enormous amount of work in the medical field. And typical applications involve classification. Instead of cats versus dogs, we might look at normal versus abnormal images. If you move sort of a layer up in difficulty, we essentially perform classification for every voxel in the image. Is this part of a lesion or not? And this is output from some code that I wrote a couple of years at Mayo Clinic to go through and segment brain tumors. And it did a great job. It was on par with the human experts. And of course, much faster. And you don't just have to do lesions, you can do organs. This is results of some, part of the system that I wrote that would extract brains from MRI scans. It does a great job and handles things like deformations due to surgical or, mass effects from brain tumors and things like that. So these kinds of tools are now easily available and you don't have to implement them. You can just basically call them. And if you move another layer up and sort of difficulty of application or utility of application, you can use these nets to start looking for biomarkers in images. For example, you might say, okay, I've segmented this tumor. Is it a glioblastoma or an oligodendroglioma? And you decide, okay, it's an oligodendroglioma based on patterns in the image. There's publications now that are looking at predicting genetic expression inside some of these lesions. And is this oligo1p19q intact or deleted? And then you can go further and start predicting things like, will the patient live beyond 120 days or not? So there are all kinds of features that you can pull out of images. And a famous paper written by a colleague of mine at Moffitt says, these medical images are more than pictures, they're data, and they can be mined. And this is a massive area of research right now. So that's had a huge impact on medical imaging. Another huge area that I'm really interested in is reinforcement learning. And this, I think, is going to have tremendous applications in medicine in any area of planning, treatment planning in particular. We'll talk about it in a bit. So I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, of course, but this slide, or the contents of this slide, is something that I presented for the last 5 or 6 years whenever I speak anywhere. So I figured, I'm just going to include it. And Rich might even be in the audience. I don't know if he is. I hope I'm not embarrassing him too much. But this is a quote from an interview that he gave in 2017. Reinforcement learning is learning from rewards, trial and error. And that's basically exactly what it is. And the reason I've quoted him here is that his textbook on the topic has been cited 50,000 times. He's got an H index of 91. Like, this is incredible. I hope, don't know, but I hope that the University of Alberta appreciates the magnitude of the scientists that they have working with them in Dr. Richard Sutton. Pretty darn impressive. Anyways, my sort of high-level hand-waving description of this is a rat in a maze. If you drop a rat in a maze and you put a reward somewhere at the end of the maze, over time, that rat is going to learn to navigate that maze and get to the reward. You can also put some traps in there, right? Some places where you get penalized if you go. So you can have positive and negative rewards in the maze. And eventually, through repeated trial and error, this rat will figure out how to navigate the maze very quickly to get to the reward. So one of the existential questions of this technique is the explore-exploit trade-off. What if there's a bigger reward somewhere else in the maze? Should you always, if you're dropped into the maze as a rat, should you run straight to the rewards or should you spend some of your effort, limited effort and limited resources to explore new parts of the maze you haven't been before? And this is not an easy problem to solve by any means. It's generally very, very difficult. But Rich and his students have developed a lot of the theory that lets us tackle this. And the kinds of applications you can do are revolutionary, just absolutely revolutionary in the real world, but I think also in medicine. So of course, one of the most famous applications was DeepMind training a system to play Go and beating the world champion. And this occurred in 2016. But things didn't stop there after they got the cover of Nature. They kept on. And can you hear this?
Yeah, that's an exciting move. I think we've seen an original move here.
충분히 얄팍고도 창의적이다. 정말 아름답고 바둑에 이끌은 아름다움을 잘 표현한 수고 굉장히 창의적인 수였다.
Except for the
This at all is to Go what Roger Federer is to tennis.
huge shot. Headlines around the world.
60 million people watched the game in China alone.
For us, it's the culmination of a 20-year dream.
That was a huge moment.
Well, okay, we've beaten the world champion. How could we go further? What could we learn from that?
There are so many possible application domains where creativity in a different dimension to what humans could do could be immensely valuable to us.
And the search time is getting better and better, like as we go from, for example, 1 to 8 in anyone.
There's been a big chain of events that followed on from all of the excitement of AlphaGo. When we played against Lisa Doll, we actually had a system that had been trained on human data, on all of the millions of games that had been played by human experts. We eventually found a new algorithm, a much more elegant approach to the whole system, which actually stripped out all of the human knowledge and just started completely from scratch. Instead of learning from human data, it learned from its own games, and that became a project which we called Alpha Zero. Zero meaning having zero human knowledge in the loop.
Alpha Zero is a kind of experiment in how little knowledge can we put into these systems and how quickly and how efficiently can they learn. The next stage was to make it more general so that it could play any two-player game, not just Go, but things like chess and shogi, which is Japanese chess, and in fact any kind of two-player perfect information game.
What we discovered was that actually this exceeded all of our expectations.
Alpha Zero could start in the morning playing completely randomly, and then by tea it would be superhuman level, by dinner it would be the strongest chess entity there's ever been.
After about 8 or 9 hours, it was strong enough to be able to go out and defeat Stockfish, the incumbent world champion, a program which was vastly stronger than Deep Blue, the program which had previously defeated Kasparov.
Traditional chess engines like Stockfish basically consist of a huge database of rules. Alpha Zero doesn't have any rules. It learns through experience. We're trying to build general algorithms, not just to play chess, not just to play Go.
The world's a messy place, and no one can exactly write down the rules by which it operates. We can work with energy systems in the real world, with healthcare systems in the real world.
So I like his quote at the end there, the world's a messy place and it's often difficult to write down the rules. No kidding. By the way, David Silver did his undergrad at Cambridge and then came to Alberta to do his PhD with Rich Sutton. So, another very famous grad of the program here. So how would you use this in medicine? Well, one of the obvious to me and to many other people too, is to use it for treatment planning, in particular radiotherapy treatment planning. So imagine you've got a reinforcement learning agent, a RAT essentially. You could use this agent to send parameters to a radiotherapy treatment planning system. This is effectively our GAIN engine. These radiotherapy treatment planning systems now, a lot of them are scriptable. You can control them with an external piece of code, and you can send commands to adjust all the parameters that are involved in radiotherapy treatment, just as if a technician was sitting there and doing it at their screen. So you can set the multi-leaf collimators, you can set the beam angle, you can set the on and off time, all the basic parameters you can control. And what once you've set those parameters, this system goes and uses the physics that it's been calibrated and quantified and qualified to do, and it will produce a treatment plan that includes estimates of dose distribution over the organs of interest. And you can think of this as the state of the game. It's like updating a video game screen in an Atari game, for example. But now you need to have a reward of some sort, some kind of a metric that measures how well you've performed. Well, of course, you've got a desired dose. That's part of the prescription that the radiation oncologist provides. So you can take your estimated plan and compare it to your desired dose, and you can come up with a single metric, a dose distribution index, for example, and you can think of that as the score. So now you've got a contained system here where it's essentially a perfect information game, and you should be able to train an agent to go through and optimize this plan and do it very, very quickly. And this is becoming more and more important because in radiotherapy right now, it's basically one size fits all. One of my colleagues at Moffitt used to say, in radiotherapy, if you have a particular disease in a particular site, you get a particular prescription, and that may be you're going to get 6 weeks of radiation at a certain dose. And he says, imagine if we had that same attitude in surgery. You came in and wanted your tumor removed, and they said, okay, you're going to get 4 hours of surgery. It doesn't matter if we're finished in 2, we're going to spend another 2 just cutting stuff away. And it doesn't matter if we're not done in 4 and there's still stuff left that we have to remove. Tough, we're going to stop after 4 hours. It just doesn't work that way anywhere else in the treatment regime, but in radiotherapy it does. So there's a real need to try and personalize radiotherapy treatment. And one of the barriers is the time it takes to make these treatment plans. So if we could accelerate this with an approach like this, it could be very beneficial. But it's a huge area of research, over 1,500 publications on using reinforcement learning for radiotherapy treatment planning since 2017, hot area. So where could we contribute as the University of Alberta? Well, there's another massive contribution to medicine that was developed here, and that's the MRI LINAC. And when I was at Moffitt, they were so proud when they got their MRI LINAC. They were advertising all over the place, and I just kind of smirked because I knew where it had been developed. This is something that we have access to here, and you could put MRI data into this loop and potentially improve the treatment planning. But the other thing that's really cool is once you sort of automate this and put it into a learning loop like this, you can start to optimize on things in addition to the quality of the treatment plan. For example, you could factor in treatment time. How long does it take to set up and perform this treatment, and how, shorter treatment times allow greater throughput and might be better for an overall population health perspective. Or if you're interested in improving quality of life for the patient, maybe you could add in the pre and post ESAS measures that you do. ESAS being another massive contribution to medicine. They use this all the time at the organizations I work for in the US. They're always doing ESAS on their patients. So the thing is, when you've got this agent in the loop, you can start optimizing on all sorts of more complex things that would be very difficult for a technician to do. So it opens up not just doing the same thing better, but doing something new. And others that you might think of. If you have planning systems, or a system that you can think of like a game engine, then this might be an appropriate way to tackle that. Okay, the third thing I'm going to talk about is something called transformers, and I'll explain that in a bit. And there are multiple applications for these. I'm going to go through three of them, so the three subparts of this. And transformers were originally developed to transform language, transform text from one language to another. So for example, English to French is a common, language translation is a common application. Language is complex, right? The trophy did not fit in the suitcase because it was too small. What does it refer to in the sentence? Well, you don't have to think too long. It refers, of course, to the suitcase. Now I'm going to change just a single word in the sentence and see what effect it has. In fact, it's the last word in the sentence. Now what does it refer to? Well, you don't have to think too long to know that it refers to the trophy. So this is called co-reference resolution problem, and it can be ambiguous what that word "it" refers to. And in order to figure this out reliably, you have to know something about other parts of the sentence, and you have to know about general relationships in the real world, like what fits in what, in order to resolve this. And sometimes the thing you're referring to might even be in a previous sentence. It might refer to something in a previous sentence. So humans just do this naturally. It's like the cats versus dogs problem, right? We can easily tell the difference between a dog and a cat. We can easily resolve this issue. We don't even think about it. But to try and code this up in rules for a computer is really, really tough. But that's the approach that has been taken for a long time for natural language processing. Well, these transformer architectures just learn to handle this and many other complexities in language, and it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the huge applications of transformers is something called BERT. It stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. They're using a chunk of the transformer to perform a language task. And the name is interesting. It's really sort of prompted a whole Muppet theme about everything in natural language processing over the last couple of years. You see Muppets everywhere. So what does this thing look like? Well, this is a general block, a high-level diagram of what BERT looks like with a few of the internals exposed. So it's composed of what are called encoder blocks. Transformers have encoders and decoders. So you can take English, encode it, and then decode it into French. So that's how the original transformer worked. Well, these guys took just the encoder side of that. And there's 110 million parameters in the base model. And you can take, the way you train this thing is you feed it in a sentence and you randomly mask out around 15% of the words. So in this case, we've replaced the word suitcase with a token that is an unknown word, and we want the system to learn to predict that. This is fed in, it's converted, passed through this system, and what you get out at the other end is a classification. So it'll make a prediction about which word in its vocabulary it should be. And it'll make a prediction for every single one of the perhaps 50,000 words in its vocabulary. And here you can see it's decided that in this particular case, suitcase is the most likely word that has been masked out. And it learns this by looking at enormous amounts of text again and again and again, trying to predict this. But the cool thing is it doesn't require any intervention by us as humans. It's a completely automated process, this random masking and prediction. So you can just let this crank on a supercomputer for varying amounts of time. The bigger the model, the longer you have to let it crank. But this predicting the masked word forces the system to learn about the syntax and the structure of the language. And what's cool is you can apply this for lots of downstream tasks and tune the language model for specific applications. So how do you use this once it's trained? This thing is called the language model. And when you pass a sentence into this thing, essentially what you get out is an encoding or a description that's context aware. It understands something about this language, like what it refers to in the example I gave earlier. So this encoding can then be passed on to what's called an application tooltip. You can think of it like snap-on tools, or you have one handle and you put different components on the end of it to do different jobs. So the snap-on tooltips are essentially different NLP tasks. For example, you might want to use this to do question and answering. And that is one of the applications that I use quite a bit. I think it's quite a powerful one and has lots of applications in medicine. So here's an example. This is a blurb of text from Wikipedia. I'm not going to read it. It's about the Normans in France. But you could ask questions, some sample questions, and give the block of text to BERT, and then give the questions to BERT, encode them, and run it through and have it try and find answers in the text for each of these questions. So in what country is Normandy located? France. When were the Normans in Normandy? 10th and 11th centuries, and so on and so forth. It'll go through and find spans of text in the document that you gave it that answer the question you gave it. Very powerful. And of course, there's a competition that is used to evaluate the performance of algorithms, and the same questions and blocks of text are given typically to undergraduates to solve. And the typical undergraduate will get about 91% on these Q&A tasks. And BERT in late 2018, early 2019 started to achieve human level performance on some of these. And of course, since then, it's just gone up. Their performance is just phenomenal as these transformer systems have grown in size. The performance increases with size, and we're still not quite yet at the limit of how big these things can get to provide increased performance. But there's a couple limitations. The answer must be a contiguous passage in the text, and the phrasing of the question is really important. If you fiddle around with the question a little bit, you can get different answers or wrong answers. So you have to play with that a bit. But nevertheless, this thing has gone on to set benchmarks across a wide range of NLP tasks, not just question and answering, but all kinds of things. And the original publication, BERT, came out in late 2018. And the last time I checked, it was running at around 33,000 citations in just over 2 years. So an enormous amount of applied and derivative work based on BERT. It's just taking over the natural language processing world. So one of the things I did when I was at Moffitt is I tuned and trained a BERT specifically for cancer pathology. And the goal was to build a system to extract tumor site and histology automatically from pathology reports. And I used a question and answer system, and I hard-coded predefined 2 questions: what organ contains the tumor and what is the type of tumor? And this is applied to every pathology report. So I used human abstracted cancer certified tumor registrars in the cancer registry do this for a living. They're trained and certified to extract this type of information from pathology reports. And Moffitt had 16 of them working for them, and I got 10 years worth of their work and used that for ground truth, and used that to train a question and answer head to work with a base language model that I trained on a whole bunch of Moffitt reports, about almost 300,000 Moffitt pathology reports, to force BERT to learn the language of pathology. So my training data set for this was just over 8,200 reports, and I had a sequestered set of just over 2,000 reports, all with ground truth known from the cancer registry to train this on. And it was basically for every possible histology and tumor site that's encountered at a large National Cancer Institute designated cancer center, a big cancer center. But it's not enough just to extract the phrases that correspond to histology and codes, because those are enormously variable. Pathologists use all different kinds of phrases. I wanted to be able to map this onto a standardized ontology, in this case, the International Classification of Diseases for Oncology version 3, this the purple book as they call it, because everybody, all the cancer registrars walk around with this book under their arm with a bazillion taggets sticking out of it as they look things up when they're interpreting pathologist reports. So we wanted to extract phrases, save those, but also map the phrases onto codes. And this is what the system looked like in the end. So we have our test data set, and the base language model, like I mentioned, was trained on almost 300,000 Moffitt path reports. That's, I don't have to do anything. It's completely automated. It's that mask a word and try and predict the missing word. And that forces Cancer BERT to learn about the specifics of the language and the syntax in pathology reports and the acronyms and things like that. Then the second part was to train, in this case, a snap-on head to answer questions. And that's what the 8,000 reports were for. And now I'm at the stage where I want to test it on the sequestered 2,000 reports. So imagine picking out a single report from the test data set. You pass this into the Cancer BERT in the Q&A head, and you'll get something out like this. Site is upper lobe lung, and histology is adenocarcinoma. This is then replicated and passed into the next stage, where I train 2 additional BERTs, but this time I train different snap-on heads, one to map the input phrase onto a site code, and the other to map the input phrase onto a histology code. And you might wonder, why are you passing site to the histology head, and why are you passing histology information to the site classification head? And the reason is that there's often correlation between the two. And so this allows it to learn and use information. For example, some tumors like glioblastoma basically only occur in the brain, and pathologists may not even mention the organ in their report. It's just known that if it's a glioblastoma, it's brain. And this system learned to correctly predict brain given a path report with glioblastoma, but no organ specified. So these come in, at what comes out the other side are these standardized codes, and then these can be used and compared to the ground truth from the cancer registry. And the results for this is a top 5, or the correct answer was in the top 5 predicted answers returned from the system about 94 or 95% of the time. So it's doing very well at extracting this information. Here's a demo.
Hi, so this is a program I've written to demonstrate Cabernet in action, and I'm going to go over the major parts of the display here. So at the top, the title, Pathology Report Extraction Review. This block of text is the pathology report, and you can scroll through it and you can see that it's quite long. It's very complex, a lot of information in there. Up at the top, I've added a tool which actually screens the pathology report to determine if there's a malignancy, and you can see here that it's determined that this report does contain a positive, at least one positive indication. This report also happens to be part of our sequestered test data set, so we do have the ground truth available from the cancer registry, and that's listed here. And you can see the site is endometrium and the histology is adenocarcinoma endometrioid. Down here are the answers to various pre-specified questions, including what's the tumor site and what is the tumor histology. And you can see if I click on these pull-down menus, it's showing the top 5 results, but in this particular case, it's basically essentially 100% certain that the site is endometrium, and that happens to agree with the cancer registry. And in terms of histology, again, it's pretty much, you can click on this to see the top 5 answers, but it's basically 100% certain that this is endometrioid adenocarcinoma, and that happens to agree with the cancer registry. Now, I've also started to extend the system by asking it to answer pre-defined questions related to tumor size, stage, grade. And you can see that these are the answers to the various questions are outlined in color in the text. So sight and histology are outlined in the sign color. So you can see histology here, adenocarcinoma endometrioid. If you scroll down, there's endometrium as the site. These new questions are, the answers are outlined in yellow. So FIGO grade 1 is the grade. This is the size that it's determined. You can see it says tumor measures such and such a size. And the tumor stage has got to be in here somewhere. There it is. Primary tumor PT, PT1B is the stage. What's cool about this is you aren't just restricted to predefined questions. I've added a field over here where you can type in a question and ask it to go find the answer. So let's, here's something. The carcinoma involves more than 50% of the myometrium. So let's see if it can find that. So we know the answer to this. How much of the myometry is involved? Hit return and then click on answer and it'll go look for it, and it says more than 50% over here, and it highlights it in red in the text and labels it as the answer, more than 50%. So there, it found that. That's good. There's type in some other things here. Let's see. Something a little more useful. How many pelvic lymph nodes were examined? Question mark. Hit return. It processes and encodes the question. Click on answer and it goes and looks for the answer, and it comes back with the answer of 21. Should be highlighted in red. There it is. Total number of pelvic nodes examined, sentinel and non-sentinel, 21. So that's pretty cool. It found that.
So, these systems now are getting very, very powerful, and you can use this sort of general question and answer approach to pull information out of all kinds of medical texts. Lots of applications of this. We could extend it to radiology reports, discharge notes, just about anything you could think of. So the next application is protein folding. And what's neat about this is, well, first of all, it's a long-standing problem in structural biology. This fellow got the Nobel Prize in 1972 for his work on amino acids and 3D structure of proteins. And in his acceptance speech, he said, we should be able to predict the 3D structure of a protein given its amino acid sequence. And ever since then, it's been this grand challenge in molecular biology to try and predict the 3D structure of a protein from its one-dimensional amino acid sequence. And this is essentially the problem. We have a 1D input, and through the complexities of structural biology, these amino acids get converted to these proteins, which then fold. And to be able to predict the tertiary, quaternary structure of these is an immensely difficult challenge. But in 2018, DeepMind scientists, back to DeepMind again, used multiple transformers to encode the amino acid sequence. Well, why not? If it can take a sequence of words, why not a sequence of something else? So let's try amino acids. And they also used a type of transformer to encode the three-dimensional geometry of where the molecules are in the protein. And 2 years later, they entered this biannual competition, which is to try and predict the structure of unseen proteins.
Protein folding is one of these holy grail type problems in biology. We've always hypothesized that AI should be helpful to make these kinds of big scientific breakthroughs more quickly. We've been working on our system AlphaFold really hard now for over 2 years. Rather than having to do painstaking experiments, in the future biologists might be able to instead rely on AI methods to directly predict structures quickly and efficiently. We decided to enter CASP competition because it represented the Olympics of protein folding.
CASP, we started to try and speed up the solution to the protein folding problem. When we started CASP in 1994, I certainly was naive about how hard this was going to be.
CASP has a metric on which you will be scored, which is this GDT metric.
On a scale of 0 to 100, you would expect a GDT over 90 to be a solution to the problem.
If we do achieve this, this has incredible medical relevance.
The implications are immense, from how diseases progress, how you can discover new drugs. It's endless.
CASP started on Monday.
Can I just check this diagram you've got here, John? This one where we ask ground truth. Is this one we've done badly on?
We're actually quite good on this region. If you imagine that we hadn't have said it came around this way, but had put it in
and down
right
instead.
spot.
Yeah.
One of the hardest proteins we've gotten in CASP thus far is a SARS-CoV-2 protein called ORF8.
ORF8 is a coronavirus protein. We tried really hard to improve our prediction, like really, really hard. Probably the most time that we have ever spent on a single target.
So we're about 2/3 of the way through CASP, and we've gotten 3 answers back.
We now have a ground truth for ORF8, which is one of the coronavirus proteins. And it turns out we did really well in predicting that.
Amazing job, everyone, the whole team. It's been incredible.
Here what we saw in CASP 14 was a group delivering atomic accuracy off the bat, essentially solving what in our world is 2 problems. How do you look to find the right solution, and then how do you recognize you've got the right solution when you're there?
All right, are we mostly here? I'm going to read an email. I got this from John Malt. I'll just read it. It says, John, as I expect you know, your group has performed amazingly well in CASP 14, both relative to other groups and in absolute model accuracy. Congratulations on this work. It is really outstanding.
AlphaFold represents a huge leap forward that I hope will really accelerate drug discovery and help us to better understand disease. It's pretty mind-blowing.
You know, these results were, for me, having worked on this problem so long, after many, many stops and starts, and will this ever get there? Suddenly, this is a solution. We'd solved the problem. This gives you such excitement about the way science works, about how you can never see exactly or even approximately what's going to happen next. There are always these surprises, and that really, as a scientist, is what keeps you going. What's going to be the next surprise?
So in July of last year, DeepMind open sourced AlphaFold, and at the same time, in conjunction with the European Bioinformatics Institute, they released shape predictions for all the proteins in the human proteome, 20,000 proteins, and all the estimated shapes for the proteins in 20 other biologically significant organisms, another 350,000 proteins. And you can go online now to the website and just look at these molecules and download their shape descriptions in standard files. And they have plans to expand this to basically every protein known to science. And for that, they got Method of the Year, Cover of Nature Methods. It's the current edition, January 2022. And in this, the editors say, you know, these deep learning-based approaches have sent shockwaves through the structural biology community. We anticipate far-reaching and long-lasting impact. And if you think about it, when somebody builds a new tool, that solves a 50-year-old grand challenge in biology, that sends shockwaves through the community, and they anticipate will produce far-reaching and long-lasting impact. Once those far-reaching and long-lasting impacts start to appear, what happens? Well, they get the Nobel Prize. So I predict that the folks at DeepMind are going to get the Nobel Prize for developing AlphaFold. And that's really cool for the AI community, because it'll be the first AI tool that's like on par with, say, an electron microscope. Think about what that did to molecular biology. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is images. So transformers were originally designed for text, and then they were extended to do amino acid sequences, and recently they've been extended to do 2-dimensional images. So you're not necessarily even restricted to 1-dimensional input signals. And this is something that's called a visual transformer. And you can think of this, the way it's implemented is you basically take an image and break it up into chunks and lay them out and feed them one by one into a transformer. And you can learn to predict what each chunk contains. And then those predictions are sent to this, in here, this diagram, they call it an MLP head, but this is like the snap-on tool head. And in this case, it's going to make a classification either per image patch or for the whole image. So just run through that again, let you watch it. You basically break the image into patches, flatten them out, feed them into a transformer. It encodes them, and that encoding information is passed to a snap-on head, which can be used to, for example, make a prediction. So this is something that convolutional neural nets are really good at. So why do this? Well, it turns out that early results and indications are that it achieves similar or better accuracy than convolutional neural nets, but uses less training data to get to the same level of performance. So that's huge, because lots of applications that we have, especially in medicine, we're training data limited. So the next really interesting thing that happened was a group at OpenAI said, well, wait a minute, transformers are already good at text. Now it looks like they can do things with images. Well, let's do both at the same time, images and text. So this system creates images from textual descriptions, and it's trained on massive numbers of image and text pairs and uses a huge transformer. So you can type something in like an armchair in the style of an avocado, and then you repeat it with a slightly different phrasing, and this helps the algorithm to generate images. So these images are generated by the transformer. It's not looking them up and feeding you an image that it found on the internet somewhere. It's actually synthesizing these images and returning them to you. And this is really, really cool. In fact, there's some nice looking chairs there. And it's interesting that it used the shape of the avocado for the chair, and the pit of the avocado is the cushion, essentially, in a lot of these. So these guys, clever as they are, decided to call this thing DALLE as a mashup between Salvador Dali and Pixar's WALL-E. You can go online and play with this. They have a web page where you can change the phrasing of the sentence and produce different outputs. So here it is producing purses in the shape of a strawberry, and there's some nice looking purses here. It's really cool. A female mannequin dressed in such and such a way here, navy shirt and yellow jeans. And you can see how this could be very useful to someone in the retail industry or a designer, all sorts of potential applications. But it's also been trained on some medical images. And not only that, it can predict cross-sectional views of objects. So here's one, cross-sectional view of a heart. And this is kind of interesting. They don't say a human heart, but clearly some of these hearts look very alien. I mean, some are pretty good and some are really, really bizarre, but it's interesting nevertheless. And last one here, cross-sectional view of a brain. And again, some of these are kind of bizarre and some of them are kind of interesting. So what would be the application of this? Well, if DALLE generates images from text, can we reverse it? Can we do the opposite? And the answer is actually yes. This has been an area that's been studied for the last several years. How do we produce a description of the image that we're looking at? So it's theoretically possible that we could train these visual transformers on pairs of medical images and the corresponding report, a pathology report, a radiology report, cardiology report, and so on. And we probably have a huge database of potential training data here at AHS. And so we could use the output text from this inverted system to pre-fill a report with boilerplate. So let's say we pass an MRI exam, a CT exam here into our transformer and have it produce output that we can use to pre-fill a radiology report. And just for laughs, we're going to call this transformer Dr. ELAD because it's DALLE in reverse, and we're going from images to text instead of from text to images. But certainly this is something that we could potentially do here. Another application I would think very possible and very powerful would be applying this to EHR data. And in my experience of EHR data, it generally falls into one of three buckets. Fixed data, which is the demographics, attributes of the patient that do not change or change very frequently over time. Then there's the vast majority of the data is time-varying data, be it labs, path results, meds, outcomes, all those sorts of things. And then finally, of course, in any EHR data, there's tons and tons of missing data, and it can help to try and fill that in. Well, transformers are potentially good at all these things, really good at time-varying data, help to impute or fill in missing data. Some transformers are great at generating text. So we could use different types of transformers to encode each of these broad classes of data and output essentially a signature or a fingerprint describing this. And these could be fed to a prediction engine. And that could be used to predict all sorts of outcomes. For example, things like length of stay. Is this patient going to be here for a long time or not? Are they going to be readmitted within 30 days? And probably a ton of other things. Well, what's potentially powerful about this is we could do the left-hand side of this, the AI guys could build that, and then the prediction engine tuning, it would be nice to set that up so you didn't have to know anything about programming, anything about AI. You could just put a resident or a fellow on this and say, use that store of signatures that's sitting there and try and predict something about the patients in this ward, and just have them play with it and come up with powerful algorithms on their own. Democratize access to this, analyzing this data. So finally, I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about some of the challenges that we face. And there are many of them, not to underestimate this. But looking back over all my years at different institutions, I think there's basically 5 things that you need to be successful. You need to have population level health data. It has to be comprehensive and cover all aspects of care. It can't just be cancer. It can't just be surgical outcomes. It can't just be psychiatric results. It has to be everything. Next, you have to have a healthcare provider that has visionary leadership that's willing to take on the risk of change. The safest thing to do is maintain the status quo. It's really risky to make change in healthcare, and it takes leadership, visionary from the top to enable this to happen. But even that's not enough. You have to have a team within the organization that's empowered and capable of translating these innovations into the clinic. And again, this is risky and requires significant technical expertise. You need a big university that has strong programs in engineering and computer science, a research-focused medical school, and a really strong AI group. And they have to be, so you're working at this medical school that has these other groups right next door. And you need non-traditional funding sources. And this requires visionary leaders in the funding side to say, this is not the sort of thing that we're going to get funded by NIH or CIHR. We got to find other ways to do that because the potential benefits are so huge. And finally, if you really want to broaden your impact, you need pathways to commercialize this, to spread it around. And this will also provide feedback from the organization, the healthcare provider, and the university. So when I was thinking about moving to Edmonton, I had this list and I went through it and I went through all my interviews and I decided that all the boxes were checked. And this is incredibly rare. These are hard challenges, and to deal with one of them is difficult. 2 or 3 is extraordinary, but to check all the boxes on this list, that's why I'm here. It's really, it's the right place, I believe. And it also happens to be the right time because Alberta is going through Connect Care. They're building Connect Care. And at the same time, we're seeing really cool innovations like transformers and visual transformers come on the scene. So I think it's the right place and the right time. And so the last thing, the one more thing is, what would I like to do most? I think the lowest hanging fruit is smart search. Imagine how Google changed the World Wide Web. For those of you who are, it's hard to even remember what the web was like before Google. And now we just take it for granted. I mean, it's a verb now in our language, go Google it. We don't have that capability in medicine, but we could build it, and we could build it here. So we could take these transformers or something similar and generate these fingerprints and store them in a searchable fingerprint store, a latent space encoding to the AI folks out there. These vectors we would store in this database. And then we could use these to do a similarity search, and we could do things like a query, find patients with lesions that look like this, and the physician draws a box around a lesion. And it goes off and very rapidly finds all patients that have images or lesions in images that look like that. And they don't just get access to the images, they get access to the complete record. They find out what they were treated with, what their outcomes were, what their pre-existing conditions were, and everything. If they have a tough case, this could help them come up with a diagnosis. What about something like this? Find all patients who are Indigenous, over 60, diabetic, stage 1 breast cancer, HER2 positive, and so on and so forth, not been treated with a drug in the past 60 days. Imagine getting that list immediately. We should be able to build this and think about what it would do to medicine. It would be on par with what Google did for the World Wide Web. And this is one of the few places in the world, I think, where we could build this. So that's enough blabbing for me. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm super excited to be here. And in the few minutes remain, happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ross. We're super excited to have you here. As you said, it's the right time and the right place, and we've got the skill set to move this important work forward. We're almost out of time, but and we've got some great questions. I just want to remind the audience that this is being recorded and you'll be able to view it later. And I'm sure Ross would be interested in receiving emails from your questions as well and responding to them. But just in the time we have, just a minute or so, Ross, I wonder, what's the first project that you're going to undertake? What is some of that low-hanging fruit that you're going to get started with right away?
So there's a couple of projects, and I've been working with people in the Department of Medicine on a couple of projects in kidney disease and MS and a few others. So there'll be prediction models. We're building models to predict outcomes. Actually, in the MS case, it might be a transformer model to pull information out of neurologist reports.
Okay, good. And just one other, we've got a few minutes left. There's been questions about its application in the clinical workflow. In your experience, what are some of the main features to consider when you're actually applying some of these measures right within the clinical workflow?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that at all. There's another whole talk on that, but there's all kinds of recommendations. And it basically comes down to you're building a new intervention, so you need to run a clinical trial on these AI models. And it's advised to run them in shadow mode or silent mode for a while you collect data. So they're not used to impact patient treatment decisions in any way. You just look at them retrospectively with a clinical team, maybe once a month. And after you start building confidence with the team and evidence that this is working the way it should, you can sort of move it over into production. And then a whole new set of issues arise, because if you produce a new piece of information, you need to be able to act on it. So who is it going to be delivered to? What are they going to do to respond to it? Are they trained to look for it and respond to it? And a whole new slurry of questions and problems arise. So the general rule of thumb is, in my experience, it's vastly, vastly more difficult to take a great AI predictor or model to translate that into the clinic than it is to build it in the first place. You can build a great model with a prof and a couple of grad students and some data, but to translate it into the clinic takes a huge team and a lot of work. It's a huge potential barrier.
And I think we'll have you back and have that as our next presentation, Ross. That's such an important
Yeah, that's a whole presentation in itself, yeah.
So I want to end off here again by thanking Amii, the University Hospital Foundation, and AHS for supporting us in the recruitment of Dr. Mitchell here. Thank Dr. Mitchell for joining us. Again, right place, right time, and exciting things happening. And thanks to all the participants for attending the session today. I'm sure Dr. Mitchell would be keen to hear from those who had questions and we weren't able to answer them today. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.